And thank you, Father Clifford, for the introduction. And thank you, Maurice, for organizing this conference and for once again showing your organizational skills and your commitment to full inclusion, as you've done throughout history, through your bravery, and through your brilliant legal mind. Thank you, Maurice. My experience with the interface between LGBTI human rights and religion goes back to 1976 when I first moved to Toronto. I started working at the Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto and became the church's liaison to the LGBTI human rights movement. It was very clear to the LGBTI community that religious opposition was the enemy, and the broad religious community was being mobilized to prevent any advancement to LGBTI human rights or inclusion. The Metropolitan Community Church of Toronto and a few other religious leaders from the United Church of Canada and from some affinity groups from other denominations stood against this. What we experienced back then is very common to what we hear around the world today, that the main opposition to LGBTI inclusion is religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia. And I say it that way to be distinctly not blaming religion, but blaming religious-based opposition and discrimination. It was also clear that whenever any argument was presented as God versus gays, we would lose. And that's why it's crucially important for the LGBTI people of faith to be involved in the movement. So it became my job and the job of MCC Toronto to present the case for religious support for LGBTI human rights and inclusion and to counter the attacks based on religious beliefs. The challenge was that there was very little support in the broader religious community, and also a lack of awareness and discussion around basic human sexuality. And this meant that there were many misconceptions and false narratives being used. The media became a crucial ally in terms of countering these misconceptions. We used a variety of approaches, including being visible in debates, in protests, in submissions to governmental bodies, in mobilizing support through petitions and press conferences, particularly highlighting our allies, and attempting to strongly make the case that many people of faith supported LGBTI rights, and those seeking to deny human rights were not representative of everyone in every faith tradition. And it is clear that a religious attack requires a religious response. Ironically, support was gathered from within, initially, support was gathered from within the Christian communities and then the Jewish communities and ultimately the Muslim community and other communities of faith. Often, LGBTI communities necessarily put substantial resources into countering religious attacks, and too often failed to proactively build and promote religious support among our allies. It is crucial in the good times to be building that support so that it is there in the difficult times. Promoting religious support is very effective in changing hearts and minds. We need to build the support rather than just react to the attacks. Over time, an increasing number of faith leaders joined our movement for equality. Whereas initially it consisted of predominantly retired clergy, eventually more and more active clergy began to speak out. At first, the LGBTI community leadership were hostile to the inclusion of LGBT people of faith. Eventually, they moved from skepticism to ultimately seeing the value of not only having us play a role, but play a leadership role. Political leaders, especially supportive ones, often felt under attack by the more right-wing religious elements, and they didn't have the language to counter the religious arguments. A very effective strategy was to develop petitions of religious leaders in support of LGBTI human rights, so that politicians could use those supportive petitions to counter the negative religious arguments. It was obvious that a religious attack required a religious response, so it was our job to mobilize that response again and again. Ultimately, the religious support for inclusion was viewed to be the mainstream, and the opposition viewed to be the fringe. Numerous times, politicians would say it was our mobilizing of support that made it possible for them to vote for the legislation for inclusion. And increasingly, the media would turn to LGBTI people of faith for comments rather than exclusively reaching out to secular LGBTI leaders. This further broke down the argument of God versus gays. Helping LGBTI people of faith to be effective media communicators is crucial for shifting public opinion and for gaining the trust of the media. Another particularly effective strategy was to engage the most extreme opposition voices, because the public, once they heard those extreme voices, moved in favor of our position. The current situation in Canada is that the United Church of Canada, the Presbyterian churches, have voted for full inclusion. The Lutheran Church and segments of the Anglican Church are also moving towards inclusion. And there appears to be increasing support among some evangelical communities. Young evangelicals in North America no longer care about homosexuality or abortion. They care about the environment and poverty. We've also seen significant support come from liberal rabbis, the Reform movement in the Jewish faith, and also some Jewish conservatives. There is also a vocal and visible number of leaders within the Muslim faith who are speaking out for inclusion. The public opinion polls in Canada have consistently shown us that one of the most supportive segments of society are Roman Catholics. Here I refer to the people, not the hierarchy. The first province in Canada to include sexual orientation in the Human Rights Code was Quebec, the most Catholic province. The first state in the United States to give equal marriage was Massachusetts, the most Catholic state. And most of the first countries in Europe to give protection and support for equal marriage were Catholic countries. The challenge is, while Catholic people have consistently shown support, the hierarchy have not. And we hope that the latest comments from the Pope will begin to change that. I've started a new organization called Rainbow Faith and Freedom to confront and decrease religious-based homophobia and religious-based transphobia in Canada and around the world, so that local faith communities and that families will be more inclusive of their LGBTI members. We're trying to change hearts and minds. I wanted to give you some background about how Rainbow Faith and Freedom came about. In 2015, I took a sabbatical and I met with many of the international LGBT organizations. And I said to them, my impression is you're proudly secular. And they all said yes. And I asked, are you working with any gay, lesbian, Muslims or Christians or Jews? And generally they said no. I then outlined my plan to start an international organization to combat religious-based discrimination against the LGBTI community by changing hearts and minds. And most of those organizations were very excited and very supportive. So in 2018, I formed and led a steering committee that drafted a vision, mission, and key programs for our organization. Rainbow Faith and Freedom is a registered not-for-profit organization, and we have applied for charitable status. We have a board of directors, we have committees, we have international partners that we work with. Our Canadian pillar is to clean up our own backyard, looking at different sectors of society and where religious-based discrimination exists. Our resource pillar, which we have recently launched, is to build resources for individuals and faith communities and organizations who want to do better. And our international pillar will begin to develop 20-year strategies with specific countries supporting the wisdom of people on the ground to help to change religious-based discrimination. There still exists in over 70 countries worldwide criminalization against same-sex behavior. And in up to 10 of those countries, LGBTI people can be executed. Religion got us into this mess, and religion needs to get us out of it. Thank you.
Brent, you got that right. The point that you made, that empathy must come from the church. Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. Here in Barbados, there have been people who have been prepared to speak out, but in camouflage sort of ways. I mentioned in my own presentation the Archbishop of the West Indies, who gave a marvelous paper at the previous Intimate Conviction Conference, in which he interpreted the satanic texts afresh. It wasn't new, but nevertheless, he said it, and it was the Archbishop of the West Indies. I learnt about that from the Church Times in the UK. It wasn't published here. Nobody knew about it. It did surprise me that Bishop Jeffert Shorey of the US Episcopal Church was invited here for the annual diocesan service, and Bishop Tenga. But nothing again was made of that. And when the doings of the Anglican Communion were published here, only page 1 was published. That was to say the punitive steps taken against the US Episcopal Church. What they didn't publish here, and I think it's a disgrace, was the fact that the primates, the majority of the primates, had called for the decriminalization of buggery. And nobody knows, unless it had been for the likes of Morris with conferences like this. So yes, I've been very much a lone voice here. Charles Morris, Reverend Charles Morris, who was another person who was prepared to speak out, has been sent off to London. But I do think it's time, because I simply can't believe that every cleric in the Anglican Church here is of a conservative disposition. I just don't believe it. But they're simply not prepared to speak out, and it's about time that they did. So thank you for that, for those practical steps. I think they're very, very important indeed. Our last speaker for this panel is Jonathan Cooper from the UK. He's an international human rights lawyer from Doughty Street Chambers in London. So welcome, Jonathan, very much.